for the first time to the world, that when he touched the craft, and he's on record as saying there's a slight buzz, when he touched the craft, a binary code, that is a regular modern computer code made up of series of ones and zeros, as some of you more technically minded people know, downloaded into his head several thousand ones and zeros. He remembered them all in order. He wrote them all on 11 pages of his notebook. Now, let me stop here and say that you might be thinking, Peter is suggesting that that's crazy. Nobody could remember several thousand ones and zeros in order. Well, I know I sure couldn't, and I'm guessing pretty much all of you couldn't. But there are people in the world who can do this. And some of you may remember a very touching movie that Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise made years ago called Rain Man, about autism. There are people, autistic people, which is such a mysterious, strange condition, who could be capable of this. Not that Jim's autistic, but the human mind is capable of many things, and I'm certainly not going to suggest that that's not authentic. Jim maintains that the book that he and John are working on will prove that this message is truly from time travelers from our future. It's an important message, and when we get that it's serious and real and authentic, the world will change around it. More power to him. If he is able to establish that in terms that I can accept, I will be the first to shake his hands and apologize for doubting him in a public forum. I have a problem with it. And I know I'm off on a tangent here, but Jim and John weave their way through this story about all. Anyway, like Larry, okay. From all of Jim's public statements and writings, this is not open to interpretation. It is simply a fact, and he will not broach dissent, I'm sorry to say. Like Larry, both he and John Burroughs are clear that they were subjected to similar outrages by the intelligence community. But this has not kept Charles Halt from appearing on TV documentaries, at conferences with Jim, and occasionally with John. And I'm convinced that, if anything, these two former law enforcement police were put through something considerably more profound than my co-author. And any one of you who doubts the sincerity or the authenticity of what I'm saying should seek out on the internet some of the talks that they have given over the years, some in tandem with Linda Howe, who did some very fine work on the Rendlesham case, and in a way helped legitimize Jim and John, as far as I'm concerned, by bringing their truth forward in a more sophisticated and professional way with their terrific PowerPoint presentations. The point is that Jim and John have gone through a series of hypnotic regressions with their therapists to try to get to material that is blocked from that night. And if you see these guys in these film clips, which they have, I might add, very courageously allowed to go public, I think you can find them on YouTube, you will see two men absolutely terrified by something that they still are not able to fully face. On December 28th, 2010, at this conference, there came a moment where John Burroughs sat on stage by himself and took questions from a highly informed, very emotional, and to a degree angry, overwhelmingly local British audience of close to 400 people who were still enraged at the Ministry of Defense for almost, in a sense, going into cahoots with the United States Air Force in keeping the lid on this terribly important incident. And when it started to come out saying whatever it was of no defense significance. The arrogance, can you imagine whatever it was in a nuclear situation was of no defense significance? You can't say that. It's not true. You don't know it unless you actually know it. And very enraged at the Air Force for jerking us around for over 30 years. And when Jim announced, I'll get back to John in a second, when Jim announced that this, on that night, for the first time he was announcing internationally the binary code, and the audience reacted very emotionally. Why have you kept this secret? Well, it seemed embarrassing. I didn't know what to do with it. Earlier this year, working on this documentary for Prometheus Public Press that's going to be on the History Channel next year, I mentioned it to one of the producers. They said, let me see it. This is fascinating. This is a binary code. We can translate it. It is being translated. Well, tell us what the message is. I can't, we're under contract with this television company, it's going to be on television next year. It was on television next year, last year is the year that was next year, and he didn't reveal it. And for months up until May, he was saying, I'm going to bring this all out at the conference that we're all speaking at in England on June 17th, and then 2 months before the conference, they withdrew. And so we never found out what that information was. Again, I wish them well in this book. I can't wait to see it. I hope that they are able to prove their case, I really do. Although I'm incredibly angry at them irregularly for some of the things they've said or alluded to about myself, about my co-author. These are good men, ladies and gentlemen, who our government has treated horrendously. And if I seem angry, it is because I am angry. And this is 25 years after I got involved in this story, and the story is now 31.5 years old. Some of you remember, like I do, the Watergate hearings and the fact that as things were going to press, so to say, or going into hearing states, that an incredibly decent man was about to oversee the impeachment proceedings of President Nixon. His name was Judge John Sirica. And there was a quote of his that stuck in my mind that to this day is a very important quote that I still occasionally go back to, which is, "Let the chips fall where they may." Okay. I hope you do get to view that footage at some point because it's very important. John, at one point, was sitting on the stage by himself, taking questions from the audience. I believe this footage is also available on YouTube. It's the Rendlesham Forrest 30th Anniversary Conference from December 28th, 2010. And a question. John, is it true, as I've heard, that when you and Jim came upon the object in the woods, you pulled your sidearm and you went into a two-handed stance? John, I think so. I may have. I'm not sure. John, is it true, as I've heard, that when you came upon the object after you had holstered your weapon, you impulsively jumped on this machine, and it went like 30 feet with you holding on to it? I don't know. It could have happened. I'm not sure if it's a real memory or an implanted memory, and not an implanted memory by them, but by us human beings. John, were you abducted? I don't know. I'm not sure. I may have been. This is a tortured human being who I have nothing but sympathy for. And yet, we all know, you don't have to be a mental health professional to know that there is a history among people who have been abused to turn on other people and hurt them. Okay, on January 23rd, 1992, I took a deep breath in my apartment on East 46th Street in New York City. I had Larry's paperwork laid out in front of me. I had learned through the grapevine that Charles Halt, who had retired about a year before, wanted to speak with me. And I had wanted to speak with him. This is the officer. This is the highest ranking officer besides Gordon Williams, who some people say, like Charles Halt, was not involved. And he wanted to speak with me, and I knew this was not going to be a fun conversation. I had to be very prepared for it. And so I did just that. I made a call. Charles Halt picked up the phone, and the first part of our conversation went like this. Hello. Mr. Hall? Yes. This is Peter Robbins calling from New York. Oh, Peter Robbins, how are you? I've looked forward to talking to you. Same with me. Did I pick a good time to call? Oh, that's fine. I can talk to you about 10 minutes or so. How long have you been retired, sir? About a year. Is it all right with you if I record this? Go ahead. And I recorded all of our conversations, alive and telephone. I always made a copy for him, and I sent it to him. The transcriptions of our conversations all appear in this book. Go ahead. I know that men who are involved are countering each other's accounts. Remember, this is 1992. And you've been very outspoken about what Larry says his participation was, is that I just wanted his participation wasn't. Why do you say that? Because he didn't come on duty until middle of January, and I can show you documentation to prove that. Well, obviously I'd like to see that. I'm sitting here with some of Larry's service record in front of me. Oh, you have that's his service record. Good. Where did it come from? I'm curious. We're going to publish that. I actually can't say right now, although he did leave the service with some of his records. He actually left. I guess the question I'm asking you, did you get something from St. Louis? He's referring here to the National Military Information Repository. I forget the full acronym. This is a huge facility I visited years ago with Ryan Wood on a certain investigation. It is where the military records of every single United States veteran are stored since the Revolutionary War. And early on, Larry started to maintain that his records weren't there. That about September of 1981, which would have been about 4 or 5 months after he left the service, they were quietly transferred to the National Security's headquarters at Fort Detrick in Fort Meade, Maryland. Charles Halt's reaction to that was, I don't believe it, and why would the NSA be interested in Larry and not in me? I'm a witness too, he's an airman, I'm a colonel. Continuing on. We're going to publish that book. I asked the question, I guess the question, right, okay, no. Okay, that's the question I'm asking you because it has a bearing on other things I might tell you or say, me. Fair enough. I'm not playing a game with you. I'm being very upfront. I appreciate that. One of the things I have here is his assignment to D-Flight to December 1980. That's probably correct. When did he arrive at Bentwaters? Shortly before that. Okay, now let me tell you this. There's a 6 to 8 week training period where one does not get a radio, a gun, a posting, or anything till one had finished up all the training. Would you believe that? Well, I have, and I can produce 100 witnesses, can tell you that, including his supervisor, who I've just talked to numerous times. Who was that supervisor? I'm not going to mention it because he requested not to be identified. What I notice here is the indication at the bottom of Lee Swain's, that was top sergeant who oversaw Larry's on-the-job training. Noted in his handwriting, quote, Airman Warren will be posted to duty roster D-Flight 10 December 1980. Intro training commence 5/12/80. And you're saying that training would have gone into January? 6 to 8 weeks, me, And I can assure you, as the deputy base commander, no cop picked up a weapon, picked up a radio, or was given a post until he completed training. I guarantee you, NATO came in and evaluated and looked at the records, and they pulled everything from medical records, reports, dental records, the whole works, and we knew that up front. That was the ongoing thing, me. Well, Charles, what I'm trying to tell you is he's a fraud, me. Well, I don't think he knows it. Why would you say that? That's a kind of strange statement to make. I'm not going to tell you here on tape. I'll tell you personally. That was my introduction to Charles I. Hall. Now let me tell you something that Colonel Hall did not want me to know because it was very embarrassing to the Air Force. Shortly before Larry was posted to RAF Bentwaters, there was a bit of a scandal. Quite a number of the security cops in D-Flight were caught with weed and with hash, and they were tossed out of the Air Force. And there was a giant gaping hole in that security flight, and they needed bodies. And so what they did, with newly arrived cops from Lackland Air Force Base training, they put them on, they gave them their PRP, their personal reconnaissance. They assigned them loaded M16s. They put them on the job as active military police personnel, and they gave them on-the-job training. The normal 6 to 8 week training period was incorporated into actually working on the job. Everybody follow here? Good. Continuing on. Colonel Halt's, okay, 1 people away from Larry. First phone call. Okay. Now, moving on here. Several months later, Charles Halt finally agreed to meet with Larry and I in person. And I was very much looking forward to this. Larry and I, we went through every bit of money we had. The 1 to 2 years that I thought it was going to take to write this book and a couple of $1,000s I'd invest. Took 9 years. The one trip that I thought we would make back to England, it was actually 15 trips between us. The few $1,000s I thought I'd spend turned out to be over $40,000. Larry spent over 60. He went fully bankrupt, I went technically bankrupt, and yet I was obsessed as he was. Part of the reason was because I had become an activist, and the fear that I experienced a few months after getting involved and realizing one night in April, when Larry filled in some missing spots for me, that I had gotten into something so far over my head. And I was scared. But I was involved. And I withdrew from the project for some months, but what brought me back had nothing to do with aliens. It had nothing to do with, you know, guys getting drugged and going through all this Manchurian weirdness. It had to do with the fact that during Larry's debriefing, where they were given a certain amount of truth and a certain amount of fiction, which is the definition of disinformation. It's not a lie. It's a skillful blending of truth, fiction, confabulation to produce a certain result. In this case, to overwhelm, to frighten, and to make you keep your mouth zipped. And they were told things and shown things that did that, in great part. One of the guys in that room was a kid from Alabama, who I can only deduce was a fundamentalist kid. He went through the debriefing with his Bible in his lap. Larry said there was almost a humming sound coming from him. It took him a bit to realize he was praying quietly to himself. A few weeks afterwards, he went AWOL. He got to Chicago trying to get back to the South. He was met by either FBI or MPs, put back on a plane, sent back to London, taken back to Suffolk. To the best of my knowledge, given no counseling, especially at that time, and given the military culture, wouldn't surprise me, given his loaded M16 back. And on a certain night, not long after that, Larry and a sergeant were on perimeter patrol, which is riding a Jeep around a road right within the perimeter fence, and they got a call on their Motorola of this kid freaking out on the tarmac where he's guarding planes, can't take it anymore, I've had it. They get there, they were the first to respond to find he had taken his M16, put it under his chin and blown the top of his head off. That made my co-author into an activist. Now, that material documenting this kid's suicide is not going to be found. And let me go on from there. In 1997, our book came out here about March, and in the United Kingdom it came out in June. Here, it did very badly. We had a publisher who was one step away from a felon. We found out after 9 years' work in a tiny, tiny advance that they had purchased the book because they were looking for a tax loss that year. And ultimately, we found a good pro bono lawyer. We had them in court for 4 years. And as we were really about to go into trial, they declared Chapter 11. And they kept a double set of books. There's no question we lost thousands. But our British publisher, who was a tiny house, believed in us, helped us pull together all the friends we had made over 9 years. That book became a major bestseller in the United Kingdom and changed the way people think about the subject of UFOs in the United Kingdom and in other places to a degree for good and ever. And it reached to the highest offices in the United Kingdom, and the best informed and most powerful people in that country knew about it. And if time allows, with some pride, I'll give you some examples of that later. Now, that summer of '97, Larry and I were back in the UK twice. We spent all of June on a 15-city speaking tour. We went back in August to do more television and radio work and speak at a Bufora conference. I came right back to the States, and in August of '97, I went out to Oregon, where I spoke at a conference on the discoveries and work of Dr. Wilhelm Reich in Ashland. One of the attendees was a great guy named Jim Martin, and Jim published a now defunct little journal called Flatland. Came out twice a year, as you can see here, very much ahead of its time. This is the early mid-90s, a review of repressed and secret information. By the way, the reason that that photo there is of Mel Gibson, this was the issue that coincided with the film some of you may remember that he made with Julia Roberts called Conspiracy Theory, which began with the producers interviewing Jim. And he said, you know, they ordered copies of every publication I had. I also went to go see the film with him, which was great fun because the first draft of the script, it was based on my friend. but I think the writers and producers very quickly realized if we do that, this guy's in for a piece of the action. He said by the time we watched the film, he said the only things left of him were the way he keeps house and his filing system. So anyway, going on from here, that will be important later. In '98, the following year, I was approached by a writer in England who became a very dear friend. I met her along with Larry through Nick Pope. Her name was Georgina Bruni. And Georgina wrote, she was a true character and a wonderful woman who sadly we lost from cancer in 2008. She was a society columnist, and she mixed with some of the most powerful and best known people within the British establishment, royal and otherwise. She read left at Eastgate. The book begins and ends almost as a legal brief. This is the evidence. You're the judge and jury. We're presenting it to you. You make your decision. But we actually close it in a very human way. We're two guys. One of us was involved, one wasn't. This is how far we've been able to take it. We can't go any further right now, but maybe you can take a little further. And it was terribly moving how our readers, many of them picked up and did take it a little further. Two brothers just over the border from Suffolk and Norfolk who had developed their passion for UFO studies from their dad, saved their money, rented a private plane, flew over the farmer's field where Larry's event had taken place, took aerial photographs, noticed patterning in the ground. It did not match where Larry's event happened. It might have been the remains of an Iron Age fort, it might have been an anomaly in the earth, but they gave it a shot. Georgina contacted me in 1998, said, I want to write a book. Can I rely on you for your assistance? I said, in every way possible. She said, Larry is, of course, a lot less trusting than you. Can I ask your help in helping me enroll him in this project? And I said, count on it. And Larry was very circumspect and distrusting, and he had every reason to do. And I did enroll him in the project, and he began to help Georgina out with this, that, and the other thing. And at the time, this is all pre-modern phone system programs, transatlantic calls, you pay by the minute. She was in London, he lived in Vermont. It cost a lot of money to do interviews, and she did hours and hours and hours, and Larry's a talker. And Larry's first question to her was, will you be recording our conversations? Perfectly normal question. And I think I should ask him whether he asked it in the spirit of paranoid concern or just curiosity. Georgina said, no, I take shorthand. However, some weeks into this process, she realized this was not really realistic, and so she started to record, but she neglected to tell him. Some months later, and this is from memory, folks, at a conference in Leeds, produced by the late, great Graham Birdsall, publisher of UFO magazine, the UFO magazine in UK, perhaps the greatest general interest print magazine in the English language in the history of UFOs, and not to be confused with our American magazine by that name. Larry's girlfriend, soon-to-be fiancée, wife, and then soon-to-be ex-wife, asked Georgina, and casually, if, and again, this is from memory, if she was recording it, and she said, oh yes, I have to, because she told Larry went ballistic, got on my case, you know, she's a government person, she's a plant, can't trust her. No, I don't think that's true. And I started to get pulled like taffy between the two of them. Larry got very angry, and then it complicated in a very human way. Larry decided to give her information that he had never released, and I'm saying right here, this is something in process, and I hope within the year this will be out. But Larry has a photograph that was taken that night on location while his event was happening, which was a phenomenal event involving a machine on the ground and 3 life forms right there, with several dozen military personnel circling it. And he gave her the photo, and then realized he had overstepped his mandate and backed off and gave her a fabricated story about it to protect the person who had taken the photo. And, you know, he screwed up. This has been thrown in his face ever since. The book, as I said, is very bold. John and Jim love to dwell on the parts of Georgina's book that are very critical of Larry, but I have dozens and dozens of emails from Georgina who I loved very much, and she loved me. We weren't boyfriend-girlfriend, we were just good friends who had a lot in common here. And I really felt very bad. And I was angry at Larry, and I was getting very tired, and the only thing that got me out of it was in the middle of this, in January of 2000, my sister died very suddenly, and I just dropped off the edge of the world for about a year, and when I returned, the book was out, filled with all of this dissonance. But here's an example of an email from Georgina from September 1998. Hi Peter, sorry for the delay. It's that time of months again uploading the magazine. Good news, I've got the book deal, and with a nice advance too. It's being published by Sedgwick and Jackson Macmillan, good publishers. Signing next week. You are one of the first to know. I'd be honored to be mentioned on your site. Georgina worked for me for several years in that I had a UFO presence, a presence on the internet called UFOcity.com. It was a damn good website, and it was a news site that posted quite a few thousand UFO stories from late 1998 to the summer of 2004. And she was my British correspondent. You were the first to know. Be honored if you'd mention it on the site, and I'll rustle up a brief thingy. How many words do you want? Thanks for answering those questions. Hope Larry is well. Please tell him my book deal and the fact that my research is uncovered enough to completely confirm that he was there. It's not looking good for Halt, though. Hugs, Georgina. Okay. In 2002, as I recall, I did something that I'm real proud of that I never really had the success again. On my own, I went to the director of special projects for the Sci-Fi Channel when it was spelled in the old-fashioned way, and they actually had great UFO programming, and it wasn't just rerunning every sci-fi thing that they ever had licensed on TV. And I presented an outline for a feature-length documentary on the Rendlesham Forrest incident. It was accepted by the organization. I was paid a nice fee. I worked as a consultant. I appeared on it along with Larry. And I gave the director there, Larry Landsman, a total sweetheart and a good guy who it's a shame that they lost, every bit of contact information for everyone involved that I knew of, including certainly people that disagreed with me or Larry, including Charles Hall. And I gave it to him with a caveat. And Stacy, let me ask you, right in my knapsack there on the side, there's my water bottle. It's right at your left there. Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks. I said, when you call Charles, I'm going to tell you what he's told many people before. Thanks, babe. Say again?
5 minutes.
Okay, great. 5 minutes till we have break. I said, when you tell him, he's going to ask if Larry is involved. You're going to say yes. And he's going to say, I really have a problem with him. He's been meddled with. In so many words, who would you rather have, a colonel or an airman? I said, Larry, this is your baby. I can't tell you what to do. I hope that you'll decide to keep Larry and me on, but anticipate that. And about a week later, he called me. He said, I spoke to Charles. I said, oh boy, what happened? He said, well, exactly what you said would happen, happened. He said, problems with Larry. You know, it's not going to be good for you to have him as part of the show. Who would you rather have, colonel or an airman? I said, what did you say? He said, Mr. Hall, I respect your opinion. I admire you. I wish you well. And if you don't want to participate, we will miss your contribution. Ooh. And he said, Hall was quiet for a moment and then said, I'll do it. But he did stipulate that he did not want to be on camera with Larry. He only wanted to be on camera with Jim Peniston, so Larry was always shown on his own. And the psychology there, I don't even know if it was intentional, but it was kind of the lone guy, lone gunman, and then the colonel and the guy who is, you know, the colonel's guy. So that is a documentary that you can see and should see. And of all of, there's only one moment that I have a problem with because of editing, really, where Timothy Good is asked about Larry, and he says he changed his story, and then they cut. And that's dirty pool. Anyway, what we're going to do right now is take a break, and I'm telling you that being preoccupied this morning, not running on a lot of sleep, looking forward to getting here, I made one tiny little error this morning, which is I forgot to take the copies of Lift at Eastgate that I hope to soak you for large amounts of money for, and I left them in Sedona. So I'll be back for another event in October, hopefully be able to get together with some of you folks. It really is a good book. And have a good break, and we'll come back and continue in a few minutes.
We'll go ahead and get back to our presentation with Peter Robbins.
Sorry about that.
Thanks, Stacy. And Stacy, I neglected to say, I just wanted to sincerely thank Phoenix Mufon for bringing me out here, and to remind you all that these events happen only because a small dedicated crew of volunteers who are passionate about this subject keep bringing these events to you. It is nothing to do with money, it has to do with love of truth and wanting to educate folks. So can we take a moment and just thank the wonderful folks at Arizona Mufon. Okay, moving along. In 1993, in February, Larry and I again met with Charles Hall in Washington, D.C. And he told us several things that were incredibly fascinating. There are three things. And before each one, he said, turn off your recorder. And then he told us. Now, he never said, this is off the record. He never said, don't repeat this. It was simply understood between gentlemen that that is what he meant by turn off the recorder. And there was no confusion for me about that. While we were having our conversation, he said something to the effect of, look, I can't say you weren't involved. It was, there's no lighting. We were out there in the woods, in the fields. We didn't see each other. But you understand, I have to be careful about such things. In other words, he acknowledged that Larry Warren was not a liar at that moment. And I had no intention of revealing that information. Now, we had a fourth person with us when we met him. That's a researcher whose name some of you may remember. He was active at that point, certainly. And he's a UFO researcher who did bring forth some interesting information. His name was Robert, or Bob, Exler. And the reason Bob came with us is because he was the person who had a car and could drive us to the meeting. Could have been anybody. And when we sat down with Charles Hall, I sat across from Hall, and we were meeting in the food court of a shopping mall right across from the Pentagon called Pentagon City. And it was rather intense in that I had said to him on the phone a few days before, Mr. Hall, we will meet with you anytime, any place, and the next days, what works for you? He was quiet on the phone for a minute, and then he said these words, do you know where the Pentagon is? And as a scrupulous nonfiction writer, investigative journalist, who knows that even when you write about subjects as dynamic and interesting as UFOs and the like, it can get a bit dry. But there's this guy who is the former deputy base commander, and he says to me, do you know where the Pentagon is? And a little voice in my head said, thank you, Jesus. I'm going to use that, and I'm Jewish. But, and we met him at the food court, and we had a very, more than an hour conversation. It was recorded. And as usual, I gave him a copy of the tape, but when we got together, I put my recorder on the table. May I record this? Yes. And at that moment, Bob